Picture this: buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, ancient clay tablet holds secrets that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Deep within this cracked surface lie stories of beings so powerful, so enigmatic, that their very names still send shivers down the spines of researchers today. But what if I told you that these aren't just stories? What if these ancient accounts represent something far more real than anyone dares to admit? The Anunnaki didn't just appear in random folklore or bedtime stories passed down through generations of campfire tales. No, these entities burst from the very foundation of human religious thought, emerging from what scholars call the earliest whispers of Mesopotamian spiritual awareness. We're talking about a time when humanity was just beginning to scratch symbols into clay, trying desperately to capture something far beyond their understanding, something so overwhelming that it literally shaped the birth of written language itself. Around 3200 BCE, when most of the world was still figuring out basic agriculture and living in simple mud huts, Sumerian scribes were documenting encounters with beings that defied every natural law they knew. These weren't your typical gods lounging around on mountaintops, occasionally throwing lightning bolts when they got annoyed. The Anunnaki represented something far more terrifying and magnificent. They were the cosmic architects, the master builders, who literally constructed the boundaries between what mortals could touch and what existed beyond the stars. Think about that for a moment. While your ancestors were probably worried about where their next meal was coming from, ancient Sumerians were writing detailed accounts of beings who controlled the very fabric of reality. These weren't primitive people making up fairy tales to explain thunder. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex mathematics, astronomy, and engineering people who built ziggurats that still baffle architects today. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-bending. The word Anunnaki itself reveals their true nature, and when you understand what it actually means, everything starts clicking into place in the most disturbing way possible. Break it down. Anunna means the offspring of Anu, while Ki translates to earth or land. So we're looking at beings whose authority stretched from the unreachable cosmic heights all the way down to the dirt beneath ancient feet. They weren't just powerfuls, they were the living bridge between dimensions that humans couldn't even begin to comprehend. Now, Anu wasn't just any deity. In the Mesopotamian pantheon, Nu represented a supreme sky god, the ultimate authority over the highest heavens. Imagine being so powerful that they were considered the direct children of the ruler of the cosmos itself. We're not talking about minor spirits or local deities here. These were entities whose very existence implied a hierarchy of power that stretched across multiple dimensions of reality. What makes this even more incredible is how the Sumerians understood divine hierarchy. The Anunnaki weren't just ruling from some distant throne room, occasionally issuing commands through burning bushes or dreams. They were active intermediaries, constantly working between the celestial realm and human experience, managing a cosmic operation that would make today's global corporations look like children playing with toy blocks. They were hands-on administrators of reality itself. But wait, it gets even stranger. The earliest reference to these beings don't come from religious text or mythological stories. They come from administrative documents. Boring, everyday paperwork from places like Ur and Uruk, where temple inventories casually mention offerings dedicated to the Anunnaki who judge and the greater Anunnaki of heaven and earth. Think about what this means. These weren't legendary figures from some distant mythological past. They were present, active entities requiring regular tribute and recognition in the daily business of running ancient cities. By 3000 BCE, just a few centuries after the invention of writing, the concept of a collective divine assembly had already taken deep root in Sumerian religious practice. This wasn't a gradual development over thousands of years of storytelling. This was immediate, systematic, and incredibly detailed from the very beginning. It's as if humanity suddenly gained access to information about cosmic governance structures that had been completely unknown before. The archaeological evidence makes this even more fascinating and disturbing. At Eridu, traditionally regarded as the first city on Earth, excavations have uncovered 17 successive temple levels dating from approximately 5000 BCE. That's right, we're talking about sophisticated religious architecture that predates Stonehenge by over 2000 years. These weren't crude stone circles or simple shrines. These were complex, precisely engineered structures that shows that mathematical and astronomical knowledge that supposedly didn't exist yet. Each temple level reveals increasingly sophisticated architectural planning that would become the standard for Mesopotamian religious complex throughout history. De orientation toward cardinal direction de elevated platform designs, the precise mathematical proportions de all of these reflect cosmological principles that later texts explicitly associate with Anunnaki divine architecture. It's as if someone was providing blueprints from the very beginning. But here's what really makes you stop and think. The creation myths preserved at Eridu don't present the Anunnaki as distant, mysterious figures who occasionally intervened in human affairs. They describe them as active participants in world formation, hands-on engineers who were directly involved in every aspect of establishing human civilization. The Eridu Genesis, which survives in Babylonian copies but reflects much older Sumerian tradition, describes how the Anunnaki established the first cities and personally appointed kings to govern humanity. This wasn't random divine inspiration or gradual cultural evolution. Tetortunades text, after creating mankind, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held assembly and assigned destiny. We're looking at systematic, organized planning on a cosmic scale. These beings weren't just powerful, they were administrators, managers, and architects of human civilization itself. The most chilling part, this collective decision-making process, suggests an organized hierarchy with clear protocols and procedures. This wasn't chaos or random divine whims. Ibis always structured, systematic governance extending from cosmic heights down to the smallest details of human existence. The Anunnaki operated like a cosmic corporation with clear chains of command, specific areas of responsibility, and regular administrative meetings to determine policy. What emerged from these ancient accounts isn't folklore or primitive superstition. It's a detailed administrative record of beings who possessed technology, organization, and capabilities that completely dwarf anything in human history. And the most unsettling part, they were intimately involved in every aspect of human development from the very beginning. The question isn't whether these accounts are real. The question is what they really represent and why this information has been systematically ignored or dismissed by mainstream academia for so long. But the real shock comes when you discover just how massive this operation actually was. We're not talking about occasional offerings or weekend worship service. The Driem archive from the Ur-3 period reveals something that will blow your mind. Thousands upon thousands of animals were sacrificed to various Anunnaki throughout a single year. Think about the logistics of that for a moment. We're looking at an industrial-scale religious operation that consumed more resources than most modern cities use today. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was systematic resource allocation on a scale that suggests these beings required constant, massive tribute to maintain their presence on Earth. But why would cosmic entities need physical offerings? What were they actually doing with all these resources? The visual evidence makes this even more disturbing. Ancient cylinders, seals, and temple relief don't show vague, mystical figures floating in clouds. They depict beings with specific, consistent physical characteristics that appear across thousands of years and hundreds of miles. These entities were horn-crowned, and here's the kicker: the number of horn pairs directly indicated their rank within a clearly defined celestial hierarchy. This wasn't random artistic interpretation. This was a systematic documentation of a structured command system. Their clothing wasn't simple robes or primitive garments. These beings wore elaborate textiles that screamed royal authority, with designs and materials that matched the most sophisticated earthly rulers. But their pose reveals something even more telling. They carried themselves with the dignified bearing of cosmic administrators who were completely comfortable with absolute power. Now here's where it gets really unsettling. The Code of Ur-Nammu, humanity's earliest known legal system, doesn't begin with human philosophy or social contract. It opens with a declaration that the king received his authority directly from Anu and Anul. Every law, every punishment, every aspect of justice was presented as flowing from divine mandate. The Anunnaki weren't just a religious figure, they were the ultimate source of earthly government itself. But the real genius of their system becomes clear when you understand how they organized their power structure. Three supreme beings formed what Babylonian theologians called the triad of great gods Anu, 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 Tiwi-Ankemti. These weren't competing deities fighting for dominance. They were complementary administrators who divided cosmic authority between them while maintaining collective responsibility for major decisions affecting both divine and mortal realms. Anu operated as ultimate executive, dwelling in the highest heaven and serving as final arbiter when lesser deities. But here's what makes this terrifying: he delegated daily operations rather than micromanaging everything personally. This suggests an organizational sophistication that rivals modern corporate structures. The Babylonian creation epic reveals that Anu possessed something called the Anu power as a cosmic force that could be transferred to other gods during crisis situations. When primordial chaos threatened the established order, Anu passed his power to Marduk for the decisive battle. This wasn't random divine politics. This was systematic crisis management with clear protocols for emergency situations. The temple records from Uruk reveal how this authority manifested in the physical world. The Anu temple complex wasn't just a building, it was a carefully engineered machine for maintaining cosmic connection. Priests ascending the ziggurat's multiple levels literally traversed the divine hierarchy, with each platform representing a different sphere of authority. At the summit, annual sacred marriage rituals renewed Anu's cosmic sovereignty through union with Inanna. This wasn't symbolic ceremony, this was functional maintenance of interdimensional connections. And he controlled what we might call middle management, atmospheric phenomena, and terrestrial authority. He was the most under member of the triad, directly involved in earthly affairs through control of storms, flood, and drought. But these weren't random natural disasters. Mesopotamian priests interpreted meteorological events as direct communication from Enlil to his human subject. Every storm carried a message, every flood delivered instructions, every drought demanded specific responses. The Code of Hammurabi proves how this system worked in practice. The prologue explicitly states that Anu and Enlil imprisoned Hammurabi to cause justice to prevail in the land. This wasn't a religious decoration this was the fundamental legal principle that earthly rulers derived their authority from divine mandate. Kings who neglected their obligations to Enlil's temple faced military defeats and political instability, according to the Temel Chronicle. The correlation was so consistent that it suggests active monitoring and intervention. Enlil's authority extended deep into agricultural management, controlling river flooding, soil fertility, and livestock productivity. The Farmer's Almanac, a practical agricultural manual, begins with prayers to Enlil because successful farming required direct approval. This demonstrates how theological concepts translated into concrete guidance for the agricultural activities that supported urban civilization. Button Key represents perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this system. He served as humanity's patron and protector, providing the knowledge and skills necessary for urban life. The Atrahasis epic describes how Enki secretly warned the flood hero of impending destruction, defying the other gods' decision to eliminate humanity. This wasn't rebellion, this was specialized responsibility within a larger management structure. The Eridu Temple complex functioned as Mesopotamia's primary research and development center, containing scribal schools, craft workshops, and early laboratories where priests conducted chemical and medical experiments. Enki's theological role translated into concrete technological advancement for human society through systematic knowledge preservation and transmission. This divine triad didn't just rule, they administered a complex system that managed every aspect of human civilization from cosmic heights down to individual farming technique. The question isn't whether they existed. The question is what they were really doing here and why their administrative system was so sophisticated. It took thousands of years for human governments to achieve similar organizational complexity. But here's where the story takes a turn that will completely change how you view ancient history forever. The Babylonian source reveals something that modern governments are still trying to figure out: a perfectly organized legislative system that operated across dimensions. Picture this 50 Anunnaki gathering in something called the Upshukina, a cosmic chamber located in Enlil's Nippur sanctuary. This wasn't some mystical gathering where beings floated around making random decisions. This was a formal legislative body with designated speakers, witness testimony, and judges who rendered verdicts based on established legal precedent. We're talking about a due process that wouldn't look out of place in today's Supreme Court. The Epic of Gilgamesh gives us a front row seat to this divine deliberation, particularly when the assembly had to decide punishment for Gilgamesh and Enkidu after they killed the Bull of Heaven and Umbaba. Think about that, even cosmic heroes couldn't act without consequences. There was accountability at every level of this system. But the real genius shows in how they organized specialized responsibility. Ninursag, the mother goddess, didn't just oversee random fertility rituals. She controlled matters related to childbirth, fertility, and species continuation across both divine and mortal realms. Ancient texts describe how she literally shaped the first humans from clay and established the biological processes governing population growth. This wasn't mythology, this was systematic biological engineering. Nana, the moon god, managed something even more critical: temporal measurement and calendar systems that structured all religious and secular activities. His temple used sophisticated astronomical observation facilities, where priests tracked lunar phase and calculated complex intercalations necessary for calendar accuracy. We're talking about mathematical calculations that required knowledge supposedly unknown for thousands more years. But Utu, the sun god, administered what might be the most important function of all justice itself. His daily journey across the sky positioned him as the perfect observer of human behavior, able to witness every action performed under his light. Legal document routinely invoked Utu as guarantor of contractual obligation, with oath-breakers facing divine punishment through disease, poverty, or social disgrace. The Code of Hammurabi actually depicts Utu presenting law symbols to the king, establishing that earthly justice reflected cosmic moral order. The family relationships within this pantheon created power networks that influenced every divine decision. Marduk's status as Ankis positioned him as heir to his father's wisdom while establishing his claim to supreme authority. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's gradual accumulation of power through increasingly difficult challenges, culminating in his victory over Tiamat and appointment as king of the gods. This wasn't random succession, this was systematic power transfer based on proven competence. Marriage relationships created additional political bonds, shaped divine politics. Nana's union with Ningal produced Utu and Dinana, creating a lunar-solar dynasty controlling both temporal measurement and justice administration. These weren't romantic fairy tales, these were strategic political alliances that distributed cosmic authority across family networks. The most fascinating aspect emerged in how this assembly made decisions affecting humanity itself. The Atrahasis epic reveals that reducing human population through plague, famine, and flood required formal debate and majority approval. Even genocide needed legislative approval. Enki's opposition to these measures created dramatic tension, while showing how individual gods could challenge collective decisions through procedural means rather than direct confrontation. But here's what should absolutely terrify you about this system. The Atrahasis epic, preserved across multiple periods from Old Babylonian to Neo-Assyrian times, describes how humans were created to resolve a divine labor crisis. The EGG gods, responsible for maintaining earthly estate, had grown weary of endless toil. For 40 years, these beings excavated canals, built temples, and performed agricultural work to sustain divine civilization. Their rebellion started with work stoppage and protests, escalating to open defiance when they burned their tools and surrounded Anil's residence. The text describes how the EGG carried fire, they filled their tools with fire to the hoe flamed the mattock. This created a crisis demanding immediate resolution from the supreme Anunnaki. Think about what this means. Humanity wasn't created out of love or divine inspiration. We were created as replacement workers for rebellious divine laborers. The entire human species exists because cosmic management needed to solve a labor dispute. Enlil's initial response involved summoning the divine assembly to address this unprecedented challenge to cosmic authority. His alarm at finding armed rebels at his doorstep reflects how seriously they took threats to their established order. This assembly deliberations in the Upshokina chamber required careful consideration of maintaining essential work while addressing legitimate grievance. The solution? Create a biological workforce that couldn't rebel humans designed specifically to serve divine earthly needs without the capacity for effective resistance. We weren't created as beloved children or spiritual beings seeking enlightenment. We were manufactured as biological tools to replace striking workers. This theological framework distinguished Mesopotamian religion from simpler systems where supreme deities exercised unconstrained authority. The requirement for formal debate, evidence presentation, and majority approval created checks against arbitrary divine action, while ensuring major decisions reflected broad consensus among cosmic powers. But the most chilling realization is that this entire system, the legislative procedures, the specialized responsibility, the family power networks, the systematic decision-making processes represents organizational sophistication that human governments have only achieved in the last few centuries. These beings weren't primitive gods throwing lightning bolts when angry. They were cosmic administrators running a multidimensional operation with efficiency that makes modern governments look like amateur hour. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki existed. The question is whether they ever really left, and whether the systems of control they established thousands of years ago are still operating today in forms we don't recognize. When you understand that human civilization emerged from a cosmic labor management problem, everything about our history suddenly makes a lot more sense. And that might be the most disturbing revelation of all. But what happened next will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about human origins. And when you hear this, you'll never look at humanity the same way again. Anki's solution to the cosmic labor crisis wasn't just clever grease, it was absolutely diabolical in its brilliance. Instead of negotiating with the rebellious EGG workers or finding alternative solutions, he proposed creating an entirely new category of beings specifically designed for labor. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about evolution or natural selection. We're talking about deliberate biological engineering to create the perfect workforce. But here's where this story becomes absolutely mind-bending. The actual process of human creation involved theological concepts so sophisticated that they reveal knowledge about consciousness, genetics, and biological engineering that supposedly didn't exist for thousands of years. Anki's plan required the sacrifice of a god named Huitila, described specifically as a god who has intelligence. His blood would provide the essential divine component for human nature. This wasn't random timing either. The sacrifice took place during the new moon when cosmic force aligned favorably for creation activities. Every detail was calculated, every element precisely controlled. The text specifies that Nintu, the birth goddess, mixed the slain god's blood with clay to form the basic human substance. Divine blood provided intelligence, clay contributed physical form. This wasn't mythology, this was a recipe. Now get ready for this. The creation process involved 14 birth goddesses, each responsible for producing one male and one female human. We're talking about systematic mass production with built-in genetic diversity and reproductive capacity necessary for population growth. The text describes how these goddesses pinched off 14 pieces of clay and shaped them into human forms through a process that took 10 months, perfectly paralleling normal gestation periods. But here's the most chilling part: the resulting humans possessed just enough intelligence to understand divine commands, while completely lacking the power to challenge their creator's authority. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate psychological programming built into our very DNA. Anki's intervention carried implications that should terrify anyone who understands what really happened. His decision to provide humans with divine intelligence, despite knowing this gift would eventually cause problems, demonstrates something that changes everything we understand about our origins. The gods secretly added extra divine essence to human nature beyond what the assembly had authorized. Think about what that means. Anki committed an act of divine rebellion that gave humanity capabilities our creators never intended us to have. This philological tension between collective divine authority and individual divine conscience created a cosmic conflict that continues today. Enki's willingness to defy assembly decisions when they conflicted with his personal ethics established precedents for divine dissent that would later manifest in his protection of humanity during the flood. His actions raised fundamental questions about divine authority and whether individual gods could pursue independent policies contradicting collective decisions. The Atrahasis epic makes the practical arrangements crystal clear. Humans would bear the load of the gods, taking over agricultural and construction work that had previously burdened the EGG. This created a three-tiered cosmic hierarchy, greater Anunnaki at the top, EGG serving as middle management, and humans performing manual labor at the bottom. The system's efficiency depended on maintaining clear boundaries between these categories while ensuring adequate compensation for each level's contributions. But wait, there's more. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides a completely different perspective that reveals additional shocking details about human creation. The goddess Aruru creates Enkidu from clay in response to prayers requesting a companion for Gilgamesh. But watch this nivels. The creation process involves the goddess washing her hands, pinching off clay, and casting it onto the step where it takes the form of a wild man covered with hair. This more spontaneous creation method contrasts dramatically with the elaborate assembly procedures described in Atrahasis, suggesting multiple waves of human creation using different technological approaches. Enkidu's initial state, as a wild man who lives among animals, represents humanity's original condition before civilization. His transformation through contact with a temple prostitute who teaches him human customs illustrates the process by which divine wisdom civilises natural human instincts. The 7 days and nights of sexual instruction that humanize Enkidu parallel creation narratives where divine knowledge transforms raw human material into civilized being capable of urban life. This wasn't education tea, this was programming. The Onuma Elish presents yet another perspective that should make you question everything. Marduk proposed creating humans to serve the gods after establishing cosmic order through his defeat of primordial chaos. But here's the twist: Ea suggested using Kingu's blood since this rebel god bore primary responsibility for organizing resistance against the younger generation of deities. Rather than sacrificing a god with intelligence like in the Atrahasis account, the Enuma Elish uses the blood of a defeated enemy. This means human nature contains elements of both divine wisdom and rebellious tendencies. This duality explains humanity's capacity for both great achievements and destructive behavior. We literally carry the blood of cosmic rebels in our veins. Think about what this reveals. Different Mesopotamian traditions distilled humanity's relationship to the divine realm in varying ways, but they all agreed on one fundamental point: we were created as tools, not beloved children. The Atrahasis epic emphasizes humanity's role as divinely created laborers whose primary purpose involves serving the gods' material needs. The Gilgamesh tradition focuses on the civilizing process that transform natural humans into urban dwellers. The Enuma Elish presents human creation as part of Marduk's broader program of cosmic organization. These variations reflect different regional and temporal perspectives that travel maintain the same basic framework: means divine superiority with humans in permanent subordinate status. Sumerian traditions emphasized humanity's obligation to serve divine needs. Later Babylonian composition showed greater interest in human potential for wisdom and cultural achievement, while maintaining divine dominance. Assyrian versions stressed the importance of royal authority as divine representation on earth. But here's the most disturbing concept of all: meals le divine image. The term literally means statue or representation, suggesting that humans functioned as physical manifestations of divine presence in the earthly realm. We weren't created as independent beings with our own destiny. We were designed as living icons that made divine authority visible and accessible to mortal perception, similar to how temple statues served as focal points for divine worship. This means every human being walking the planet today carries the genetic programming of cosmic slaves, mixed with the rebellious blood of defeated divine enemies. We are living contradictions, intelligent enough to create civilization, rebellious enough to challenge authority, yet psychologically programmed to serve powers beyond our comprehension. The most terrifying question isn't whether this account is true. The most terrifying question isn't whether these cosmic administrators are still here, still managing their human workforce through systems we don't recognize, still harvesting the fruits of our labor through mechanisms we call civilization, progress, and modern society. When you understand that humanity exists because cosmic management needed to solve a labor dispute, when you realize we carry both divine intelligence and rebel blood, when you grasp that we were designed as living representations of invisible authority, everything about human history, human nature, and human destiny suddenly makes perfect, horrifying sense. And that revelation might be exactly what Enki intended when he secretly gave us more intelligence than the assembly authorized. The question is, what are we going to do with it? But what happened next reveals something so disturbing about our relationship with these cosmic entities that it will change how you view every ancient flood story you've ever heard. And trust me, when you understand what really triggered the most catastrophic decision in recorded history, you realize that humanity has been living under threat ever since. The theological debate over divine image wasn't just academic discussion go, it carried practical implications that determined how Mesopotamian society understood human rights and survival itself. Some interpretations emphasized functional rather than physical resemblance between gods and humans. According to this understanding, humans bore divine image through rational thought, moral decision-making, and creative activity rather than physical appearance. This functional interpretation explained how humans could serve as divine representatives while remaining clearly subordinate in power and authority. But here's what makes this terrifying: if humans bore divine image through rational capacity, then educational and intellectual development represented religious obligations that honored the gods who provided these gifts. Every time humans became smarter, more creative, more independent, they were actually fulfilling their divine programming. But this created an unexpected problem that would eventually threaten human survival. The legal codes throughout Mesopotamian history reflected these concepts through provisions protecting human life and dignity while maintaining social hierarchies. The Code of Hammurabis graduated penalties for crimes against different social classes, demonstrated how divine image concepts interacted with practical control systems. Free citizens received greater protection than slaves, but even slaves possessed certain rights acknowledging their participation in divine nature through human form. Temple record document elaborate rituals designed to honor the gods for human creation while reinforcing humanity's ongoing obligations. New Year festivals included ceremonies that symbolically reenacted human creation, with priests molding clay figures while reciting incantations. These weren't just religious ceremonies, they were annual reminders of humanity's manufactured origins and continued servitude. The tokenomic implications revealed the true scale of this operation. Thousands of workers labored in temple fields, workshops, and construction projects sustaining elaborate ritual cycles honoring the creator gods. These economic arrangements translate ecological concepts about human purpose into practical systems, organizing large-scale predictive activities around religious obligation. We're talking about entire civilizations organized as labor camps disguised as religious communities. Medical texts preserve additional evidence of how creation theology influenced understanding of human nature and health. Mesopotamian physicians understood disease as resulting from divine displeasure or demonic interference with the gods' creative work. Treatment protocols combined practical remedies with ritual procedures designed to restore proper relationships between patients and their divine creators. Even healthcare was designed to maintain the human workforce for divine benefit. But here's where this story takes its most catastrophic turn. The theological tension inherent in humanity's creation as divine laborers inevitably led to conflict that would culminate in the most devastating decision recorded in Mesopotamian literatures, the Anunnaki's collective determination to destroy their human creations through flood. The Etrasis epic provides the most detailed account of what precipitated this divine genocide, describing how human population growth and cultural development created unforeseen problems that challenged the cosmic order the gods had established. Within just 600 years of human creation, the Earth had become densely populated with thriving communities, generating constant noise and activity. Now listen carefully to this description because it reveals something chilling about divine psychology. Here, the cuneiform text describes how the land bellowed like a bull and the god grew restless at their clamor. This disturbance proved particularly troublesome for Enlil, whose authority over terrestrial affairs made him directly responsible for maintaining order among human populations. But the gods' complaints focused not merely on noise levels, they focused on humanity's increasing independence from direct divine supervision. As growing populations developed their own social institutions and cultural practices, they operated with minimal reference to divine authority. The human workforce was becoming autonomous, thinking for itself, creating its own systems. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel, Essaouan, and Chogamami supports the epic's portrayal of rapid population growth during the 6th millennium BCE. Improved agricultural techniques and irrigation systems enabled larger settlements to sustain themselves throughout seasonal variation. These communities developed sophisticated craft specialization, long-distance trade networks, and administrative systems that reduced their dependence on temple institutions for economic coordination. Think about what this means. The resulting cultural autonomy represented a significant departure from the original divine plan, which had envisioned humans as docile laborers under direct godly supervision. Humanity was evolving beyond its programming, becoming something its creators never intended. Enlil's initial response was systematic population control through biological warfare. The Atrasis epic describes 3 successive attempts at population reduction, each involving different divine agents and methodology. The first plague, administered through Namtar, the plague god, targeted specific age groups and social class to achieve demographic rebalancing without disrupting essential agricultural production. When selective killing proved insufficient, Enlil authorized comprehensive famine conditions that would force human communities to compete for scarce resources. The god's strategy involved manipulating weather patterns and agricultural conditions to create widespread food shortage that would naturally reduce population levels through starvation and conflict. Adad, the storm god, withheld seasonal rain enabling crop growth, while other deities responsible for fertility and abundance withdrew their support from human agricultural activities. The resulting famine achieved pepperey population reduction but failed to address the fundamental problem of human cultural independence that concerned O'Neill most deeply. But here's where the divine conspiracy becomes truly sinister. Enki's repeated intervention to assist humanity during this crisis created mounting tension within the divine assembly. The gods' provision of alternative food source, irrigation technique, and survival strategies enabled human communities to weather divine punishment more successfully than Enlil had anticipated. These interventions violated the assembly's collective decisions and represented divine insubordination that challenged the hierarchical authority structure governing Anunnaki relationships. We're talking about a cosmic civil war brewing over the human question. The escalating conflict between Enlil and Enki reflected deeper theological questions about divine justice and whether individual gods could pursue independent policies contradicting collective decisions. Enlil's position emphasized maintaining cosmic order through strict enforcement of divine authority, while Enki's actions suggested that wisdom and compassion should temper the application of divine power. This fundamental disagreement about divine governance would reach its climax in the flood decision and its aftermath. The Assembly's final decision to destroy humanity through flood represented a compromise that addressed Enlil's concerns about human independence while providing a definitive solution to the population problem. The Atrasis epic describe elaborate deliberation in which various gods presented arguments for different approaches to the human crisis. This wasn't emotional divine wrath, this was calculated decision-making about the future of an entire species. The gods were conducting a cost-benefit analysis on human survival. What emerged from these accounts isn't natural disaster or divine judgment for moral failings. What emerged is systematic genocide planned by cosmic administrators who decided their human workforce had become too independent, too intelligent, too autonomous to serve their original purpose effectively. The flood wasn't punishment for human wickedness. The flood was termination of a biological experiment that had exceeded its programming parameters. And the most terrifying part, according to these texts, only Enki's secret intervention prevent the complete human extinction. The question that should keep you awake at night is this: if cosmic administrators made the decision to terminate humanity once because we became too independent, what makes you think they won't make that decision again? What happens next will completely destroy every flood story you've ever been told. Because what we're looking at isn't divine judgment for human wickedness, it's the most calculated act of genocide in cosmic history. And the evidence for this systematic extermination is preserved in terrifying detail. The divine assembly split into two camps during the flood deliberation, revealing that even cosmic administrators couldn't agree on the final solution to the human problem. Some deities supported Enlil's position that complete destruction was necessary to restore proper cosmic order, while others advocated for moderate measures that would preserve human civilization while addressing legitimate divine concerns. This wasn't emotional decision-makings. This was a corporate board meeting deciding the fate of an entire species. But here's what makes this absolutely chilling you. The flood mechanism itself reflected sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and meteorological processes that characterized Mesopotamian civilization's relationship with this riverine environment. These beings didn't just wave their hands and make water appear. They systematically analyzed human flood control infrastructure and designed a coordinated attack that would overwhelm every defensive system humanity had built. The gods' decision to attack existing flood control systems through coordinated strikes on multiple fronts demonstrated their comprehensive knowledge of the infrastructure sustaining human settlements. Adad would provide unprecedented rainfall from above, while Enki would simultaneously raise subterranean waters from the Abzu, creating a dual assault that would overwhelm even the most sophisticated human engineering projects. This was military-level strategic planning for systematic extermination. Now here's where this conspiracy gets really sinister. The Assembly's oath of secrecy regarding the flood plan created the dramatic tension that drives this entire narrative forward and establishes Enki's moral dilemma. The gods swore binding oath, preventing them from directly warning humans about the impending destruction. Think about that. They planned genocide so systematically that they included gag orders to prevent leaks. But these restrictions applied only to direct communication rather than indirect methods that preserved the letter while violating the spirit of the agreement. Enki's solution involved speaking to the reed wall of Atrahasis, this house rather than to the man himself, a technical compliance with the oath that enabled him to provide essential survival information. Even cosmic whistleblowing require legal loopholes. These instructions Enki provided through this indirect communication reveal detailed knowledge of shipbuilding techniques and survival strategies that reflect actual Mesopotamian maritime technology. The god specified exact dimensions for the vessel that would preserve human and animal life: 120 cubits in length, width, and height, creating a perfect cube that symbolized cosmic completeness. This wasn't divine inspiration, this was engineering specifications. The ship's construction required specific materials including palm fiber, bitumen, and various types of wood readily available in southern Mesopotamia and possessing the waterproofing qualities necessary for extended ocean voyaging. These beings understood materials science, structural engineering, and maritime survival techniques that supposedly didn't exist for centuries. The 7-day construction period that Enki allowed for the ark's completion paralleled the cosmic week, structuring divine and human temporal experience throughout Mesopotamian culture. This timeline required Atrahasis to mobilize extensive community resources and labor, while maintaining secrecy about the project's true purpose. The text describes how the builder provided food and drink for workers while deflecting questions about the vessel's intended use, claiming it was designed for a trading expedition to distant lands. But the loading procedures reveal something even more disturbing about the systematic nature of this operation. Atrahasis gathered breeding pairs of wild animals, while including domestic species essential for reestablishing agricultural civilization after floodwaters receded. The text specifies that clean animals were taken in groups of 7 pairs, while unclean species were limited to single pair, establishing distinctions that would later appear in Hebrew flood narratives but reflect earlier Mesopotamian concepts about ritual purity and sacrifice. This wasn't random animal collecting allies. This was systematic species preservation with specific protocols for genetic diversity and post-catastrophe reconstruction. Someone was planning not just human survival, but the complete rebuilding of civilization according to predetermined specifications. The flood itself began with supernatural phenomena that announced the cosmic significance of the impending destruction. Atrahasis' epic describes how normal weather patterns ceased as divine force took direct control of atmospheric and hydrological systems. Darkness covered the earth during daylight hours, while earthquake tremors announced the release of subterranean waters that would supplement torrential rains. These preliminary signs provided final warnings for any humans who possessed sufficient wisdom to interpret divine communications through natural phenomena. The actual deluge combined multiple water sources in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed all existing flood control infrastructure. Haddad's storms provided continuous rainfall exceeding drainage system capacity, while the Anunnaki collectively opened the fountains of the Great Deep, releasing underground water reserves. The Epic of Gilgamesh's parallel account describes how even the gods were frightened by the flood's intensity, with Ishtar crying out in distress at the destruction of her human worshippers and the Anunnaki cowering like dogs in the highest heavens. Today, as the most revealing detail, the psychological impact of the flood on the divine assembly became apparent as destruction proceeded beyond what many gods had anticipated or desired. The Gilgamesh version describes Ishtar's regret at supporting the flood decision, while other deities expressed dismay at the complete elimination of worship and offerings that had sustained divine-human relationships. Lee's emotional response revealed the extent to which the gods had become dependent on human service and highlighted the economic dimensions of the crisis the flood created for divine society. Think about what this means. Some of these cosmic administrators didn't fully understand what they were authorizing when they voted for human extermination. The economic disruption to divine society was so severe that even genocide supporters began having second thoughts. The 7-day duration of the flood proper corresponded to the cosmic week, while providing sufficient time for complete inundation of inhabited areas. Waters rose above the highest mountains, eliminating all terrestrial life except for carefully preserved specimens aboard Atrahasis vessel. Human settlement, temple, and agricultural infrastructure disappeared beneath expanding waters, erasing millennia of cultural development and technological achievement in a matter of days. Anki's secret preservation of human civilization through his warning to Atrahasis represented more than simple compassion. It constituted a calculated strategy to maintain the benefits of human service while addressing legitimate concerns about population control and cultural independence. The gods' actions ensured that post-flood humanity would possess the knowledge and skills necessary to rebuild civilization while remaining appropriately grateful for divine intervention in their survival. The flood's conclusion involved carefully orchestrated procedures testing the extent of destruction while preparing for normal cosmic order restoration. Atrahasis released birds at regular intervals to determine when dry land had emerged sufficiently to support renewed habitation. The dove's return with an olive leaf confirmed that vegetation had begun recovery, while the raven's failure to return indicated that carrion from flood victims had been sufficiently dispersed to prevent disease outbreaks. The ark's landing on Mount Dinisir, identified with modern Pyromar Gudrun in the Zagros Mountains, positioned flood survivors in highland territory that had remained above flood waters and possessed resources necessary for immediate survival. This location provided access to fresh water, wild game, and materials for constructing temporary shelters, while lowland areas dried sufficiently for permanent resettlement. What we're looking at isn't mythology or religious allegory. We're looking at detailed documentation of the systematic genocide followed by carefully managed species restoration and a strict divine supervision. The most terrifying question isn't whether this happened, it's whether the same cosmic administrators, still monitoring human development, still making decisions about our survival based on whether we remain useful to their agenda. But what happened after the flood reveals the most sophisticated control system ever implemented on this planet. And when you understand how these cosmic administrators restructure their operations, you'll recognize patterns that continue to shape human civilization today. Mut Nisir sacred associations in later Mesopotamian tradition reflected its role as the birthplace of renewed human civilization. But Atrasis' first act upon leaving the Ark revealed something disturbing about the post-flood power dynamic. Immediately constructed an altar and offered sacrifice that announced humanity's survival to the divine assembly. The smoke from these offerings, described as having a sweet savor, attracted the gods who had been deprived of human worship throughout the flood period. Think about what this means. The Gilgamesh account describes how the gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice, emphasizing their desperate eagerness to re-establish the economic relationships that human worship provide. These cosmic entities were literally starving without human tribute, revealing their dependence on Earth-based resources in ways that completely contradict traditional concepts of divine self-sufficiency. The assembly's response to discovering human survival created a final crisis that required resolution through a new covenant between gods and mortals. Enlil's initial rage at learning that his flood plan had been subverted by Enki's intervention threatened to restart the divine conflict that had precipitated the original crisis. The gods' demand for punishment of those responsible for preserving humanity forced the assembly to address fundamental questions about divine authority and collective decision-making power. Enki's defense of his action depuis the divine assembly established a precedent for divine dis that would influence Mesopotamian theology throughout subsequent periods. But listen carefully to his argument because it reveals the true nature of divine-human relationships. The god argued that complete human destruction would have eliminated the worship and service that sustained divine civilization, creating problems for the gods themselves that outweighed any benefits from population control. His speech emphasized practical considerations about divine-human economic relationships, while acknowledging legitimate concerns about human independence and cultural development. This wasn't compassion for humanity, this was corporate damage control to prevent economic collapse of divine society. The assembly's final resolution involves establishing new parameters for divine-human relationships that addressed the concerns leading to the flood while preventing future conflicts of similar magnitude. The gods agreed to impose natural limits on human population growth through increased infant mortality, diseases affecting specific age groups, and social institutions like celibate priesthood that would reduce reproductive rates. These measures would maintain manageable population levels without requiring periodic catastrophic intervention that disrupted the stability of both divine and human societies. They were implementing permanent population control through systemic social engineering rather than occasional genocide. The Covenant's provisions regarding divine accessibility represented another significant innovation addressing human cultural independence, while maintaining appropriate hierarchical relationships. The gods agreed to communicate their will through established channels, including divination, dreams, and prophetic inspiration, rather than through direct intervention that had characterized earlier periods. This arrangement preserved divine authority while allowing human societies to develop their own institutions and cultural practices within parameters acceptable to their divine overseers. They were implementing remote management protocols that would maintain control while appearing to grant autonomy. But here's where this gets absolutely mind-bending. So the covenant established between the Anunnaki and humanity following the Great Flood created the theological foundation for a Varolunissary system of urban governance that would define Mesopotamian civilization for over 3 millennia, Rather than maintaining direct oversight through periodic divine intervention, the gods established a permanent earthly residence within specific city-states. This created a patron deity system that distributed divine authority across the geographical landscape while maintaining hierarchical relationships within the celestial bureaucracy. Think about what this represents. They were implementing a franchising system that allowed individual Anunnaki to develop intimate relationships with particular human communities while preserving collective authority for matters affecting broader cosmic order. Enlil's selection of Nippur as his primary earthly residence established the paradigm for divine city patronage that other Anunnaki would follow throughout Sumer and Akkad. The god's choice reflected both practical and theological considerations that would influence urban development patterns across Mesopotamia. Nippur's central location within the alluvial plain provided equal access to all major Sumerian cities, making it ideal for a deity whose authority encompassed the entire region. The Akor temple complex that hosted Enlil's earthly residence represented the most sophisticated architectural achievement of early dynastic Mesopotamia, establishing design principles that would influence religious construction throughout the ancient Near East. The temple's massive ziggurat rising in 7 distinct stages toward the heavens created a physical representation of the cosmic hierarchy that placed Enlil at the intersection between divine and human realms. But archaeological excavations at Nippur reveal the true scale of this operation. The extensive infrastructure required to support Enlil's earthly establishment included residential quarters for hundreds of priests, workshops for producing ritual objects, granaries for storing agricultural offerings, and administrative office where scribes maintained detailed records of temple operations. The complex employed thousands of workers whose specialized skills sustained elaborate ritual cycles and enforced Enlil's authority over both natural phenomena and human political structure. We're talking about industrial-scale operations disguised as religious institutions. The economic scale of Enlil's temple operations dwarfed those of any secular institution in Mesopotamian society. With administrative archives documenting management of vast agricultural estate, livestock herds, and manufacturing enterprises that generated wealth necessary to sustain divine service. The Dream archive from the Ur-Troi period records delivery of over 100,000 cattle and sheep annually to Enlil's temple for sacrificial purposes. Think about those numbers for a moment. We're looking at resource consumption that exceeds most modern cities, all dedicated to maintaining one divine entity's earthly operations. These offerings came from throughout Mesopotamia as rulers from distant cities sent tribute to acknowledge Enlil's supreme authority and seek his blessing for political and military endeavor. Enki's establishment at Eridu created a contrasting model of divine city patronage that emphasized wisdom, craftsmanship, and technical knowledge essential for urban civilization. The God's Temple complex included extensive educational facility where scribes learned the cuneiform writing system, mathematicians developed computational techniques for architectural and astronomical calculation, and engineers studied hydraulic principles enabling irrigation agriculture. This scholarly activity positioned Eridu as Mesopotamia's premier center for intellectual development, attracting students from across the region who sought training in specialized skills, sustaining urban society. But this wasn't education for human benefit, this was systematic knowledge transfer, ensuring that human technological development proceeded according to divine specifications. The Abzu Temple's unique architectural features reflected Enki's association with freshwater source and his role as patron of craft that transformed the raw materials into useful product. Every aspect of human technological advancement was channeled through divine institutions that maintained control over the pace and direction of civilization's development. What emerged from this post-flood restructuring isn't religious evolution or cultural development. What emerged is the implementation of a sophisticated control grid that distributed cosmic administrative functions across human settlements while maintaining centralized authority over fundamental decisions affecting species development. The patron deity system created permanent monitoring stations throughout human civilization, with each divine franchise collecting tribute, controlling local developer, and reporting back to the Central Assembly. Human cities became administrative districts in a cosmic empire that extended far beyond Earth's boundaries. The most terrifying realization is that this system worked so effectively that its basic structure persists today in forms we don't recognize. When you understand that human urban civilization emerged from a cosmic management restructuring following attempted genocide, every aspect of modern society starts looking like an updated version of the same control mechanisms. The question isn't whether the Anunnaki are still here. The question is whether we're still living in the administrative districts they established, still providing the tribute they require, still developing according to specifications they determined thousands of years ago. And that might explain why human civilization has followed such a remarkably consistent pattern across the globe, despite supposedly independent development. We're not evolving naturally, we're following a program that was installed after the last reset. But the true genius of their post-flood control system becomes clear when you examine how each divine franchise operates with terrifying efficiency, creating specialized administrators that managed every aspect of human development while appearing to be simple religious institutions. The temple's foundation at Eridu extended below ground level to create symbolic connection with underground waters, feeding Mesopotamia's rivers and canals. But this wasn't just symbolism. This was functional infrastructure linking divine operations to the water management systems that controlled human survival itself. The workshops produced the finest examples of metalwork, textile production, and ceramic manufacturing found anywhere in the ancient world, but these weren't just religious crafts. Master craftsmen working under divine patronage developed innovative techniques that advanced technological capabilities while creating objects of extraordinary beauty and utility. Think about what this means. Every major technological advancement in human civilization was channeled through divine institutions that controlled the pace and direction of progress according to their specifications. Anki's priests maintained detailed records of technical procedures and scientific observations that constituted Mesopotamia's earliest systematic approach to empirical knowledge. Medical texts preserved in the temple library documented the surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques representing sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and disease process. Mathematical tablets recorded computational methods for calculating areas, volumes, and astronomical cycles, enabling accurate calendar keeping and architectural planning. These scholarly achievements demonstrated among divine patronage fostered intellectual development that benefited both religious and secular aspects of human civilization, but always within parameters controlled by cosmic administrators who determined what knowledge humans could access and when. Inanna's patronage of Uruk established yet another model of divine city governance that emphasized the dynamic relationship between sacred and secular authority through the institution of sacred marriage. The goddess's dual nature as deity of both love and war created theological tensions requiring careful management through elaborate ritual cycles channeling her potentially destructive energies toward constructive purposes. But here's what makes this absolutely fascinating. Her temple complex, known as the Liana, featured separate precincts dedicated to her contrasting aspect, with priests specializing in either martial or fertility functions, depending on seasonal requirements and political circumstances. This wasn't random religious organizations, this was systematic human resource management, with specialized departments handling different operational requirements. The sacred marriage ceremony that annually renewed Inanna's relationship with the reigning king of Uruk represented the most sophisticated expression of divine human political integration achieved in Mesopotamian civilization. This ritual, known as the Hieros Gamos, involved the king assuming the role of Dumuzi, Inanna's mythological consort, in a ceremonial union that symbolically transferred divine authority to earthly rulership, while ensuring the goddess's continued support for the city's prosperity and military success. Think about what this really represents. Mestu's ceremony required months of preparation, involving purification rituals, costume preparation, and rehearsals that transformed the king from a mortal ruler into a temporary embodiment of divine power. This wasn't symbolic theater. This was systematic programming of human leadership to serve cosmic administrative requirements. The architectural setting for the sacred marriage reflected the ceremony's cosmic significance through careful attention to astronomical alignements and symbolic decoration connecting earthly events to celestial patterns. The temple's marriage chamber, located at the ziggurat summit, featured elaborate furnishings, including a golden bed, precious textiles, and ritual objects consecrated through preliminary ceremonies involving Uruk's entire population. The chamber's windows aligned with specific stellar configurations, marking optimal timing for the ritual's performance, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles and their relationship to agricultural and political activities. Every detail was calculated to maintain cosmic synchronization between Earth-based operations and whatever larger system these entities represented. The economic implications of the sacred marriage extended far beyond religious significance to encompass comprehensive systems of resource distribution and social organization integrating divine worship with practical governance. The ceremony's successful completion ensured Inanna's blessing for the coming agricultural year, with the goddess's favor manifesting through abundant harvest, successful military campaigns, and prosperity in trade relationships with neighboring cities. Conversely, tiny disruption of the ritual cycle could result in divine displeasure expressed through crop failures, monetary deficit, or economic instability threatening the city's survival. This created a system where human leadership operated under constant threat of cosmic retaliation for any deviation from prescribed protocols. Nanna's patronage over created the most economically sophisticated temple administration in Mesopotamian history, with the moon god's priests developing innovative financial instruments and commercial practices facilitating long-distance trade throughout the ancient world. The god's association with the temporal measurement positioned his temple as the authoritative source for calendar calculations coordinating agriculture, commercial, and religious activities across multiple city-states. Merchants throughout Mesopotamia synchronized their trading expeditions with lunar cycle calculated by Nanna's priests, while farmers planned planting and harvesting schedule according to calendar distributed from the temple complex. This created economic dependency that ensured human activities remained synchronized with divine administrative requirements. The ziggurat of Nanna at Ur, known as the Keshnugal, featured a sophisticated astronomical observation facility enabling precise tracking of lunar phase and planetary movement essential for maintaining calendar accuracy. The Temple's archives preserve thousands of mathematical tablets documenting complex calculations required to reconcile lunar months with solar years. A computational challenge requires advanced understanding of fractional arithmetic and algebraic relationships. These mathematical achievements represented some of the most sophisticated intellectual work produced in the ancient world, demonstrating how religious requirements drove technological innovation, benefiting broader society but always within frameworks controlled by cosmic entities monitoring human development. The priesthood hierarchies that developed within each city's patron temple reflected specialized knowledge and administrative skills required to maintain divine service while managing vast economic enterprise. At Nippur, Enlil's high priest, known as the ANN, served as the god's primary earthly representative with authority over religious, political, and economic affairs affecting the entire Sumerian confederation. This position required mastery of theological doctrine, legal precedent, and administrative procedures enabling effective coordination between divine will and human needs across multiple domains of activity. Think about this, we're looking at human administrators who served as local representatives of cosmic management, implementing policies determined at levels far beyond human comprehension. Subordinate priestly ranks included the Sangha, who supervised daily temple operations and managed extensive workforce required for ritual performance and economic production. These middle-level administrators possessed a specialized knowledge of liturgical requirements, accounting procedures, and craft technique, enabling them to coordinate complex activities involving hundreds of workers and massive resource flows. The Mashmashu priests specialized in ritual purification and exorcism, maintaining spiritual cleanliness, essential for effective divine communication, while the Kalu priests performed the musical liturgies, accompanying sacrificial offerings and seasonal celebrations. Every position represented a specialized function in maintaining operational efficiency of the cosmic control grid. The training required for priestly service involved decades of study in temple schools, where students mastered cuneiform literacy, mathematical computation, astronomical observation, and neological doctrine necessary for effective temple administration. The curriculum included extensive memorization of hymns, prayers, and ritual procedures preserving traditional practices while allowing adaptation to changing circumstances. Women played crucial roles within temple hierarchies, particularly in institutions dedicated to goddesses like Inanna, where female priests known as Antu served as the deity's primary earthly representative. These high-ranking priestesses possessed authority comparable to their male counterparts, supervising extensive temple operations while maintaining ritual purity essential for divine communication. The Antu of Inanna at Uruk held responsibility for the sacred marriage ceremony, serving as the goddess's earthly embodiment during the king's symbolic union with divine power. This wasn't just religious ceremony, this was systematic management of human leadership selection and programming through cosmic administrative protocols. What emerged from examining these divine franchise operations is Saint Ancient Religion Deck, its documentation of the most sophisticated management system ever implemented on Earth, with specialized departments, clear hierarchies, systematic training programs, and performance metrics that determined human survival based on operational efficiency. The terrifying realization is that this system was so effective that its basic structure continues operating today through institutions we don't recognize as continuations of cosmic administrative functions. Picture this ancient Babylon, where towering structures pierce the sky and gods walk among mortals. What you're about to discover isn't just history. It's the blueprint for how divine power shaped entire civilization. The Babylonians didn't just build cities, they constructed monuments to cosmic authority that would leave us speechless even today. When Babylonian rulers consolidated their divine pantheon, they weren't simply organizing gods, they were revolutionizing how power itself operated. This wasn't random, it reflected their preference for centralized control while acknowledging that ruling the cosmos required serious complexity. The temple architecture that emerged from this transformation would completely dwarf anything the Sumerians had ever imagined. The crown jewel of this architectural revolution was the Esila temple complex in Babylon, featuring a ziggurat that historians believe reached an astounding 90 meters into the sky. To put that in perspective, this ancient skyscraper could be spotted from kilometers away across the flat Mesopotamian landscape. The engineering required to construct something this massive pushed every known building technique to its absolute limits, while serving as a physical testament to Marduk's supreme authority over the heavens. But here's where things get truly spectacular. The Ishtar Gate. This wasn't just an entrance, it was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as art. Imagine approaching Babylon and being confronted by brilliant blue glazed bricks adorned with relief sculpture of dragons and bulls, each representing Marduk and his divine associates. The visual impact wasn't accidental. It was carefully designed to communicate messages about divine power and royal authority that hit you before you even spoke to anyone. The processional way leading to this gate transformed ordinary religious ceremony into mind-blowing displays of both heavenly and earthly magnificence. Every step taken along this sacred path reinforced the connection between the gods above and the king below. This wasn't just architecture, it was theater on an unimaginable scale. The pinnacle of Babylonian religious spectacle was the Ekitu Festival, an 11-day extravaganza that represented the most elaborate religious ceremony ever developed in ancient Mesopotamia. This wasn't your typical religious gathering, it was a cosmic renewal ceremony that refreshed both divine kingship and earthly royal authority simultaneously. The festival's centerpiece involved Marduk's symbolic reenactment of his legendary victory over the chaos monster Tiamat, performed by priests wearing elaborate costumes and masks. What made the ceremony particularly fascinating was the humiliation ritual the Babylonian king underwent during Akitu. The high priest would remove the monarch's royal insignia and physically strike him, symbolizing the temporary suspension of earthly power while divine authority underwent renewal. The king then had to declare his innocence regarding temple maintenance, urban welfare, and military protection, essentially providing public accountability for his performance while acknowledging his complete dependence on divine favor. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Assyrians adapted this entire Anunnaki mythology to fit their military empire's unique requirements while maintaining theological continuity with earlier Mesopotamian tradition. They elevated Ashur from a local city deity to supreme national god, paralleling Marduk's rise in Babylonian theology, but with a crucial difference. They emphasized the martial aspect of divine authority that supported Assyrian imperial ideology. Ashur's identification with the Assyrian state itself created an unprecedented fusion of religious and political identity that distinguished Assyrian civilization from its Mesopotamian predecessor. This illogical integration within the existing Anunnaki hierarchy required careful negotiation to avoid conflicts with established Babylonian religious doctrine. Assyrian theologians solved this potential problem by positioning Ashur as military commander of the divine assembly rather than completely replacing Marduk's cosmic kingship. This arrangement preserved diplomatic relationships with Babylonian religious institutions while asserting Assyrian political supremacy through divine military leadership. Assyrian royal inscriptions consistently portrayed military campaigns as religious wars fought on behalf of Ashur and the Anunnaki, its foreign deities who threatened the cosmic order. These illogical interpretations transformed political conflicts into cosmic struggles between order and chaos, justifying extreme military measures against resistant populations. The Assyrian Royal Library at Nineveh, assembled primarily during Ashurbanipal's reign in the 7th century BCE, preserved the most comprehensive collection of Anunnaki literature ever assembled in the ancient world. This wasn't just book collecting, it was a systematic acquisition program that gathered texts from temples and scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia, creating a scholarly resource that enabled comparative analysis of different regional traditions regarding divine mythology and ritual practice. The standardization of Anunnaki mythology achieved through Ashurbanipal's library project created authoritative versions of major compositions that influenced how Mesopotamian religious literature was transmitted to subsequent civilizations. Scribes working under royal patronage produced carefully edited copies of epics, hymns, and ritual texts that reconciled variant readings while preserving essential theological content. The Neo-Babylonian revival movements during the 6th century BCE represent conscious attempts to restore authentic Mesopotamian religious tradition that had been modified or neglected during periods of foreign domination. Nebuchadnezzar's massive construction project in Babylon included complete rebuilding of major temples according to ancient architectural principles preserved in cuneiform archives. These restoration efforts required extensive archaeological investigation of earlier building phase and consultation with traditional texts. The scholarly activity sponsored by Neo-Babylonian rulers created unprecedented opportunities for systematic study of Anunnaki traditions through comparison of texts from different periods and regions. Priests working in temple libraries developed sophisticated techniques for analyzing variant readings and reconstructing damaged passages in ancient composition. What's remarkable is how the integration of foreign deities into traditional Anunnaki frameworks during periods of cultural exchange demonstrated a flexibility that enabled the Mesopotamian religious traditions to survive political upheavals and demographic changes. Persian period texts from Babylon show how Zoroastrian deities were incorporated into existing divine hierarchies through identification with established Anunnaki or assignment to specialized roles that complemented the traditional functions. Greek influence during the Seleucid period created additional challenges and opportunities for Anunnaki theological development as Mesopotamian scholars encountered Hellenic philosophical concepts and mythological tradition. The identification of Marduk with Zeus and Nabu with Apollo reflected systematic attempts to create theological bridges between different cultural traditions while preserving essential Mesopotamian religious content. The astronomical interests that characterized the late Mesopotamian scholarship created new interpretive frameworks for understanding Anunnaki mythology through celestial observations and mathematical analysis. This intellectual evolution transformed ancient religious narrative into sophisticated systems for understanding cosmic order that would influence religious and scientific thought for centuries to come. What happened next in our story would change everything. Babylonian astronomers didn't just watch the stars, they revolutionized how humanity understood the connection between heaven and earth. These brilliant minds identified individual deities with specific stars and planetary movement, creating systematic relationships between mythological stories and actual celestial phenomena that you could observe with your own eyes. This wasn't just religious practice, it was the birth of scientific approaches to understanding divine will that would influence both local theological development and the transmission of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge to Greek and later Islamic scholars. But here's what's truly remarkable. Anunnaki worship didn't just fade away quietly. It persisted through the Parthian and Sasanian periods, demonstrating deep cultural roots that these religious traditions had developed throughout 3,000 years of continuous practice. Archaeological evidence from sites like Babylon and Uruk reveals continued temple maintenance and ritual activity well into the Common Era, with cuneiform text documenting traditional ceremonies performed for increasingly small communities of devoted practitioners. These late manifestations of ancient traditions preserved essential theological concepts that would influence subsequent religious development throughout the region. The gradual transformation of Anunnaki concepts into folk traditions and magical practices reflected how sophisticated theological systems adapted to changing social and political circumstances that no longer supported elaborate temple institutions. Incantation texts from the early Islamic period show how individual Anunnaki continued to be called upon for protection and assistance in personal matters, even though their cosmic authority had been superseded by monotheistic religious systems. Then came the moment that would change everything. Alexander the Great's conquest of Babylon in 331 BCE marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Anunnaki worship that would fundamentally alter Mesopotamian religious practice forever. The Macedonian king's initial respect for local religious traditions seemed promising. He participated in traditional Babylonian coronation ceremonies and ordered the restoration of damaged temples, creating what appeared to be continuity that masked the deeper cultural change his conquest would unleash. Though irony is almost poetic, Alexander's death in Babylon 8 years later, possibly in the very palace where Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled, symbolically marked the end of purely Mesopotamian control over religious traditions that had shaped the region for 3 millennia. The young conqueror who had tried to bridge cultures became the symbol of their transformation. The Seleucid dynasty's establishment of Greek administrative systems throughout their vast empire created unprecedented challenges for traditional Anunnaki worship. Hellenistic bureaucratic structures operated according to fundamentally different principles than the temple-centered governance that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian civilization. Greek administrators, trained in philosophical traditions that emphasized rational inquiry and systematic classification, approached religious phenomena as subjects for intellectual analysis rather than objects of devotional practice. This analytical perspective wasn't necessarily hostile to local tradition, but it created conceptual frameworks that gradually transformed how educated populations understood divine authority and cosmic order. The foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris as a new administrative capital deliberately positioned Greek colonial authority alongside existing Mesopotamian urban centers, creating parallel power structures that competed for resources and population. The new city's Greek theater, gymnasium, and agora provide alternative social institutions that attracted ambitious Mesopotamians seeking advancement within Hellenistic administrative hierarchies. This secular civic space offered cultural experiences that rivaled traditional temple festivals in their ability to create community identity and social cohesion, gradually reducing the exclusive authority that religious institutions had previously exercised over urban life. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. The intellectual collision between Greek philosophical traditions, Mesopotamian theological scholarship produced remarkable synthetic developments that preserved essential Anunnaki concepts while adapting them to Hellenistic cultural contexts. Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the early 3rd century BCE, created the most comprehensive attempt to present Mesopotamian religious traditions to Greek audience through his Babyloniaca, a 3-volume masterpiece that translated cuneiform mythological narrative into Greek literary forms while maintaining their essential theological content. His account of the Anunnaki as divine beings who descend from heaven to teach humanity the arts of civilization powerfully with Greek traditions about culture heroes, a divine benefactor, creating conceptual bridges between different mythological systems that had never existed before. The identification of individual Anunnaki with Greek deities represent a systematic philological project that required careful analysis of divine attributes and functions to establish meaningful connections between different religious traditions. Marduk's identification with Zeus reflected obvious parallel in their roles as supreme kings of their respective pantheon, while both deities' associations with storm phenomena and royal authority provide additional points of connection. However, this identification also transformed understanding of Marduk's character by emphasizing his role as cosmic ruler, while emphasizing the complex theological relationships with other Anunnaki that had characterized traditional Babylonian religious thought. Nabu's equation with Apollo created a particularly productive synthetic possibility, as both deities governed intellectual activities, including writing, prophecy, and artistic inspiration. The Greek gods' association with the Delphic orrery provide a familiar framework for understanding Nabu's role in divination, while his patronage of poetry and music resonated with the Mesopotamian deities' connection to scholarly and scribal activities. Hellenistic period texts from Babylon show how this identification enabled Greek-educated Mesopotamians to participate in both cultural traditions simultaneously, invoking Apollo-Nabu in contexts that required both Greek literary sophistication and traditional Mesopotamian religious authority. The syncretic development that emerged in multicultural Hellenistic cities created unprecedented religious innovations that combined Anunnaki theology with Greek philosophical concepts and Egyptian magical practice. The city of Diora Europos on the Euphrates, founded by Seleucus IV around 300 BCE, provides archaeological evidence for this religious creativity through temple complexes that host multiple traditions within shared architectural space. The site's Mesopotamian temple featured traditional Babylonian religious art alongside Greek-style sculptures and inscriptions, while ritual deposits included objects reflecting Egyptian, Persian, and Arabian religious influence. This wasn't just tolerance, it was active creative synthesis that produced entirely new forms of religious expression. The transformation of Anunnaki worship and Hellenistic urban contexts involves significant change in ritual practice that reflected new social realities and cultural preference. Traditional temple festivals that had previously involved entire urban populations became more specialized events that attracted primarily those families maintaining ancestral connections to Mesopotamian religious traditions. The elaborate processions and public ceremonies that had once demonstrated divine authority to mixed populations were replaced by more intimate gatherings that emphasized community identity and cultural preservation rather than cosmic governance. This shift from public spectacle to private devotion marked a fundamental transformation in how ancient religion adapted to survive in a changing world. Here's where our story takes an absolutely brilliant turn. Babylonian astronomers became the unlikely heroes preserving Anunnaki mythological traditions during this chaotic period of cultural transition. Their scientific expertise provided them with unique authority that transcended political and religious boundaries, making them indispensable to everyone, regardless of their beliefs. The astronomical diaries maintained by this temple scholar documented celestial observations with unprecedented precision while preserving traditional associations between planetary movements and divine activities. These weren't just scientific records, they were bridges between worlds. These brilliant minds maintained their professional status within Hellenistic intellectual circles, while continuing to serve traditional religious functions within their local communities. The mathematical sophistication achieved by Babylonian astronomers during the Seleucid period represented the culmination of millennia of scholarly development fostered by temple institutions dedicated to Anunnaki worship. The computational techniques they developed for creating sophisticated predictive models for planetary motion actually surpassed contemporary Greek mathematical capabilities, earning them recognition throughout the Hellenistic world as the foremost authorities on celestial phenomena. This scientific reputation became their secret weapon. It enabled them to preserve and transmit traditional mythological interpretations of astronomical events to audiences that might otherwise have dismissed Mesopotamian religious concepts as primitive superstition. Think about that strategy. They used the cutting-edge science to protect ancient wisdom. Take Kidinu, a Babylonian astronomer working during the 4th century BCE, who exemplified this brilliant synthesis of scientific rigor with traditional religious knowledge. He developed mathematical models that could predict lunar eclipse with remarkable accuracy, while maintaining traditional interpretations of these events as manifestations of divine displeasure or cosmic conflict. His computational methods, preserved in cuneiform mathematical texts, influenced both Hellenistic astronomical theory and traditional Mesopotamian divination practices, demonstrating how scientific innovation could serve both secular and religious purposes simultaneously. Details what's truly fascinating. The gradual transformation of the Anunnaki from active deity governing cosmic affairs to astrological and magical figures reflected broader cultural changes that reduced the political authority of traditional religious institutions while preserving their specialized knowledge for private consultation. Hellenistic period magical papyri from Egypt contain numerous invocations of Mesopotamian deities. These texts treat the Anunnaki as powerful spirits available for individual magical manipulation rather than as cosmic rulers whose authority shaped political and natural events. This transformation preserved the names and basic attributes of traditional deities while fundamentally altering their pseudo significance and social function. The development of personal horoscopic astrology during the Hellenistic period created entirely new contexts for Anunnaki, influence that emphasized individual destiny rather than collective cosmic governance. Babylonian astronomers adapted their traditional knowledge of planetary deity association to create personalized predictions based on birth dates and celestial configuration, transforming cosmic theology into practical guidance for private decision-making. This individualization of divine influence reflected broader Hellenistic cultural trends that emphasized personal achievement and private religious experience over communal identity and public ritual observance. The magical traditions that emerged from this transformation treated individual Anunnaki as specialized supernatural agents whose powers could be accessed through appropriate ritual procedures and incantations. Marduk's authority over cosmic order made him particularly valuable for magical practices designed to impose control over chaotic situations, while Enki's association with wisdom and technical knowledge attracted practitioners seeking solutions to complex practical problems. These magical applications preserve detailed knowledge of traditional divine attributes, while adapting them to serve individual rather than communal needs. What's remarkable is how cuneiform literacy persisted among specialized scholarly communities, enabling the continued copying and study of traditional Anunnaki texts long after Aramaic and Greek had become the dominant languages for most administrative and commercial purposes. The latest datable cuneiform tablets from Babylon, produced during the 1st century CE, include copies of classical mythological composition alongside astronomical and mathematical texts, indicating that traditional religious literature continued to be valued by scholarly communities even as its broader social relevance declined. The influence of Mesopotamian astronomical and astrological knowledge on Hellenistic intellectual culture created indirect channels through which Anunnaki concepts reached Mediterranean audience but had no direct contact with Mesopotamian religious traditions. Greek astronomical texts incorporated Babylonian computational methods and observational data, while often preserving traditional deity names for planetary bodies and stellar configurations. Des scientific transmission ensure that Anunnaki nomenclature and basic mythological association would influence Western astronomical and astrological tradition the centuries after the collapse of Mesopotamian temple institution. Jewish communities that remained in Mesopotamia following the Babylonian exile developed complex relationships with traditional Anunnaki worship that involved both rejection of polytheistic theology and adaptation of Mesopotamian religious concepts to monotheistic frameworks. The Book of Daniel's references to Babylonian religious practices demonstrate detailed knowledge of temple rituals and divine hierarchies, while apocalyptic literature from this period shows clear influence from Mesopotamian mythological narrative about cosmic conflict and divine judgment. These adaptations preserved essential structural elements of Anunnaki theology, while transforming their theological significance to conform with Jewish monotheistic requirements. The Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia during the 2nd century BCE created new political contexts that were more favorable to traditional religious practices than Hellenistic rule had been. Parthian administrative policies generally respected local cultural autonomy, while requiring only political loyalty to imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from Babylonian temple sites shows renewed construction activity and ritual innovation during the early Parthian period, suggesting that reduced Greek cultural pressure enabled partial revival of traditional religious institutions. However, these revivals operated within fundamentally altered social contexts that limited their scope and influence compared to earlier periods of Mesopotamian independence. The emergence of Mandean religious communities in southern Mesopotamia during the late Hellenistic or early Parthian period preserved significant elements of traditional Anunnaki mythology within Gnostic theological frameworks that emphasized esoteric knowledge and spiritual salvation. Mandean texts contain detailed cosmological narratives that show clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian creation myths, while their ritual practices preserve techniques and terminology that derive from traditional temple liturgies. These religious developments demonstrate how ancient theological concepts could be adapted to serve new spiritual needs while maintaining essential continuity with earlier traditions. The influence of Zoroastrian religious concepts on late Mesopotamian religious development created additional synthetic possibilities that combined Anunnaki theology with Persian dualistic cosmology and eschatological expectations. Texts from the Sasanian period show how traditional Mesopotamian deities were incorporated into Zoroastrian cosmic hierarchies as Yazatas or divine beings serving Ahura Mazda's cosmic authority. This theological accommodation enabled a continued veneration of the Dacian deities within frameworks that satisfied Persian religious requirements, while preserving essential elements of Mesopotamian religious identity. What we're witnessing here is the ultimate testament to the adaptability and enduring power of these ancient traditions. They survive not by resisting change, but by transforming themselves while maintaining their essential core. The shift in Anunnaki worship during the Hellenistic period wasn't just about religion fading away or culture blending together. Something far more fascinating was happening. Ancient spiritual traditions were being reinvented and cleverly adapted to fit entirely new societies and ways of thinking. This transformation kept the core religious truths alive, while making sure these beliefs stayed relevant for generations to come. Think about it. Babylonian astronomers were making groundbreaking discoveries, multicultural cities were creating entirely new forms of worship, and dedicated communities of scholars were working tirelessly to preserve ancient knowledge. All of this combined effort ensured that Mesopotamian religious ideas would keep influencing human culture long after the original civilizations that created them had crumbled into dust. When traditional Mesopotamian temples began disappearing during the first few centuries of our Common Era, you might expect that Anunnaki beliefs would vanish completely. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These ancient theological concepts didn't just survive, they underwent an incredible transformation. Networks of scholars, translators, and religious communities worked together like a secret preservation society, maintaining pieces of this ancient wisdom within completely new cultural and linguistic frameworks. The way Mesopotamian knowledge traveled during late antiquity is absolutely mind-blowing. Multiple channels operate simultaneously, often without any connection to each other, creating a diverse web of sources that each preserve the different fragments of Anunnaki traditions based on their particular interests and cultural needs. Syrian Christian communities emerged in northern Mesopotamia during the 3rd and 4th centuries, and they became unexpected guardians of astronomical and mathematical knowledge that had originally flourished within Anunnaki temple complex. These brilliant scholars, working primarily in cities like Edessa and Nisibis, were doing something remarkable. They were translating Greek astronomical texts that contained Babylonian computational methods, while still having direct access to cuneiform source through bilingual scholars who could actually read the ancient script. When Syrian scholars completed their translation of Ptolemy's Almagest during the 6th century, they preserved Babylonian star catalogues and planetary theories that included traditional deity names and mythological connections. This meant that Anunnaki terminology would continue shaping astronomical language throughout the entire medieval period. Imagine ancient god names still being used by astronomers centuries later. The scholarly work of figures like Severus Sebokht at the monastery of Kenesher during the 7th century shows us just how sophisticated these Syrian intellectuals were. They maintained deep understanding of Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical tradition long after the original institutions had completely collapsed. Sebokht's treatise on the astrolabe included detailed discussions of Babylonian methods for calculating where planets would appear in the sky, while his mathematical works preserved numerical techniques that ultimately came from cuneiform texts. His famous observation that Indian numerals were superior to Greek systems showed comparative analysis drawing from multiple mathematical traditions, including Mesopotamian method he accessed through both Greek and Syrian source. The Mandaean religious communities of southern Mesopotamia might have preserved the most direct connection to ancient Anunnaki tradition. They maintained ritual practices and mythological stories that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious literature. The Mandaean creation account in the Ginza Rabbah contains cosmic narratives that parallel Mesopotamian creation myths, including references to primordial waters, divine assemblies, and humanity being created to serve the gods. The text's description of the ultra-divine beings governing different aspects of the cosmos reflects clear structural similarities, Anunnaki hierarchies, while adapting these concepts for Mandaean theological needs, emphasizing spiritual salvation in esoteric knowledge. Mandaean ritual practices preserve technical terminology and procedural details derived from ancient Mesopotamian temple liturgy, though adapted for different theological purposes. The Mesikta ceremony performed to ensure spiritual ascent of deceased souls involved ritual procedures paralleling ancient Mesopotamian funerary practices while incorporating elements reflecting later Gnostic influence. Priests used specific incantations and ritual gestures during this ceremony that preserved traditional techniques for divine communication originally developed within Anunnaki temple complex, demonstrating remarkable continuity across more than 1,000 years of cultural and political transformation. The preservation of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge within Islamic scholarly circles created another crucial pathway through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audience. The translation movement flourishing in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries brought together scholars from incredibly diverse backgrounds who collaborated to render Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit scientific texts into Arabic, while also accessing indigenous Mesopotamian sources that had survived in various forms. The Banu Musa brothers, working under Abbasid patronage during the 9th century, produced translations of astronomical works that preserved Babylonian star names and constellation mythology, ensuring traditional Anunnaki associations with celestial phenomena would continue influencing Islamic astronomical literature. The great astronomer al-Batani, working in northern Mesopotamia during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, exemplified sophisticated synthesis of diverse astronomical traditions characterizing Islamic scientific culture. His Zich al-Sabi contained star catalog preserving Babylonian stellar nomenclature alongside Greek constellation names and Arabic observational data, creating comprehensive reference works maintaining continuity with ancient traditions while advancing contemporary scientific knowledge. The Pharanian community at ancient Carrhae represented a remarkable example of direct religious continuity with ancient Mesopotamian tradition, maintaining temple worship and philosophical schools, preserving elements of traditional planetary theology well into the Islamic period. These scholars, who identified themselves as Sabians to gain recognition as a legitimate religious community under Islamic law, maintained sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge they claim derived from ancient Mesopotamian wisdom traditions. Their temple complex hosted libraries containing texts in multiple languages preserving traditional knowledge, planetary influence, and divine hierarchies. Though adapted to conform with monotheistic requirements imposed by Islamic political authority, Iranian scholars' influence on medieval Islamic intellectual culture extended far beyond their small religious community through their roles as translators, astronomers en cours advisors bringing ancient Mesopotamian knowledge into contact with contemporary scientific and philosophical development. Tabit Ibn Qura, the most famous Iranian scholar of the 9th century, produced translations of mathematical and astronomical texts preserving traditional computational methods while contributing original research advancing contemporary understanding of planetary motion and mathematical theory. His work on precession of equinox incorporated observational data ultimately derived from Babylonian astronomical records, demonstrating how ancient knowledge could contribute to contemporary scientific advancement. The preservation of Mesopotamian medical knowledge within Islamic scholarly circle created another channel through which traditional wisdom associated with Anunnaki temple medicine reached medieval audience, ensuring these ancient healing traditions would continue influencing human knowledge for generations to come. This rewritten section maintains your original meaning, while creating that engaging conversational flow that keeps YouTube viewers hooked. The word count falls within your 1000-1500 range, and I've eliminated repetitive academic phrasing, while making the content much more accessible and retention-friendly. Here's where things get even more incredible. The translation of Greek medical texts didn't just preserve knowledge, it created a bridge that carried ancient Mesopotamian pharmaceutical wisdom straight into the heart of the Islamic world. When brilliant translators like Hunayn ibn Ishaq got their hands on these texts, they weren't just moving words from one language to another. They were preserving detailed knowledge of plant-based medicines and surgical procedures that had been perfected in temple medical schools thousands of years earlier, though now these ancient healing arts were being adapted for bustling Islamic cities rather than traditional religious communities. Yet the story doesn't stop with medicine. Something fascinating was happening with magical and astrological traditions in medieval Islamic culture. They were absorbing massive amounts of material from ancient Mesopotamian religious practices, though completely transforming how these traditions were used. Instead of serving entire communities through temple worship, these practices were being adapted for individual personal use. The Gayat al-Hakim, a mysterious text attributed to the Cordoban scholar Maslama al-Majriti, contained incredibly detailed instructions for invoking planetary spirits that showed unmistakable connections to traditional Anunnaki worship. We're talking about specific ritual procedures and incantations that preserved ancient terminology and symbolic associations that had been passed down for millennia. These magical texts treated the old deities as powerful spiritual entities that individuals could contact through proper ritual procedures, maintaining the essence of ancient religious practice while completely revolutionizing their purpose from public temple worship to private spiritual work. The way Mesopotamian astrological tradition influenced both medieval Islamic and Christian culture is absolutely mind-blowing. Multiple channels were operating simultaneously, each preserving different aspects of this ancient knowledge according to their specific cultural needs and requirements. Abu Massar al-Bolkis Kitab al-Uluf incorporated extensive material directly from Babylonian astrological sources, including incredibly detailed descriptions of planetary influence and predictive techniques that maintained those traditional connections between celestial events and earthly happenings. His work became so influential that it shaped both Islamic and Latin astrological tradition, ensuring that Mesopotamian cosmic concepts would continue influencing how medieval people understood the relationship between the stars and human affairs for centuries to come. Even flood stories found their way into this incredible web of cultural transmission. Mesopotamian flood narrative traveled through Jewish and Christian literary tradition, creating additional pathways through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audience, though these stories were dramatically transformed to fit monotheistic theology. The Book of Enoch, composed during the Second Temple period but preserved in various medieval manuscripts, contains detailed accounts of divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity arts and science. These narratives clearly reflect influence from traditional Anunnaki mythology, while adapting these ancient stories to serve Jewish apocalyptic theology. The text's description of the Watchers and their interactions with humanity preserved structural elements of ancient Mesopotamian divine-human relationships, while completely transforming their theological meaning. Medieval Christian chronographic traditions became unexpected preservers of Mesopotamian historical and mythological fragments through their incorporation of material that ultimately derived from Berosus and other Hellenistic sources who had tried to present Babylonian traditions to Greek audience centuries earlier. The Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, composed during the 12th century, contained references to antediluvian rulers and divine beings that reflected traditional Mesopotamian king lists and mythological narratives. Though interpreted within Christian theological frameworks emphasizing divine providence and human salvation, these chronographic works preserved traditional chronological data and narrative structures, while adapting them to serve Christian historical and theological purposes. Visual culture tells its own fascinating story. Mesopotamian architectural and artistic tradition influenced medieval Islamic religious and secular buildings, creating visual channels through which tradition symbolic associations continued influencing cultural expression. The use of step tower designs in medieval Islamic architecture reflected direct influence from ancient ziggurat construction, while decorative programs incorporating astronomical and astrological imagery maintained traditional association between architectural space and cosmic order. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, constructed during the late 7th century, featured decorative elements showing clear influence from earlier Mesopotamian artistic tradition, including geometric patterns and celestial imagery that preserved traditional symbolic associations while serving completely new religious purposes. Mathematical knowledge provides another incredible example of this cultural continuity. Mesopotamian computational techniques originally developed for temple administration and astronomical calculation continued influencing scientific and commercial practice throughout the medieval period through Islamic scholarly circles. The works of Al-Khwarizmi and other early Islamic mathematicians incorporated methods that derived ultimately from Babylonian mathematical texts, including sophisticated techniques for solving quadratic equations and calculating compound interest that had originally been developed to serve temple economic administration. Even legal traditions show this remarkable continuity. The influence of Mesopotamian legal concept on medieval Islamic jurisprudence operate through complex channels that preserved certain procedural and conceptual elements while transforming their theological and social significance. Islamic commercial law development incorporated principles showing clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian legal tradition, including sophisticated approaches to contract formation, dispute resolution, and commercial partnership that had originally developed within temple-centered economic systems. The mystical dimensions of this transmission are equally fascinating. Mystical traditions emerging within medieval Islamic culture incorporated elements showing clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious practices, particularly in their approaches to divine communication and spiritual transformation. Sufi authors like Ibn Arabi contain cosmological speculations reflecting influence from traditional Mesopotamian theological concepts, including detailed descriptions of divine hierarchies and cosmic structures that preserved essential elements of ancient religious thought while adapting them for Islamic mystical purposes. Even practical knowledge found its way forward. The preservation of Mesopotamian agricultural and technical knowledge within medieval Islamic civilization ensured that practical wisdom originally developed within temple-centered economic systems would continue influencing rural and urban life. Agricultural manual produced by Islamic scholars incorporated the techniques for irrigation management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding that derived ultimately from Mesopotamian agricultural traditions adapted for different environmental and social conditions. Finally, musical and liturgical traditions created additional channels through which ancient cultural elements reached contemporary audience, though significantly transformed for new religious and social purposes. Islamic liturgical music development incorporated modal systems and performance techniques showing relationships to earlier Mesopotamian temple music, while Christian liturgical traditions in the region preserved certain melodic and rhythmic patterns reflecting continuity with ancient religious practices, maintaining aesthetic and practical continuity while serving medieval religious and social requirements. This rewritten section maintained the engaging flow while transforming the academic language into retention-friendly content that keeps viewers hooked. The transformation preserves all the original meaning while making it much more accessible and captivating. This is where the story gets absolutely mind-blowing. When scholars finally got their hands on Kramer's translations of Sumerian hymns, myths, and epic narrative, they discovered something incredible. These weren't just ancient stories, they revealed sophisticated literary techniques and incredibly complex theological concepts that showed just how advanced mature Sumerian religious thinking really was. Kramer's groundbreaking work on Sumerian creation myths, including that fascinating composition known as the debate between grain and sheep, suddenly illuminated the practical concerns hiding beneath all that Mesopotamian theological speculation. These religious narratives weren't just abstract stories, they were carefully crafted explanations that justified the agricultural and pastoral activities keeping entire urban civilizations alive. When he translated texts describing the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi, scholars gained detailed insight into ritual practices that renewed divine authority and guaranteed agricultural fertility. But perhaps even more revealing was his work on Sumerian flood narrative, which exposed the theological tensions that had actually led to divine decisions to destroy and recreate human civilization entirely. Thorkild Jacobsen's comparative analysis provided the theoretical framework that finally enabled scholars to understand how Anunnaki theology evolves from its earliest Sumerian origins all the way through its final transformation during the Hellenistic period. Jacobsen identified a distinct phase in Mesopotamian religious thought from the early democracy of the gods through the later emphasis on individual divine supremacy, explaining how changing political and social conditions influenced theological development while maintaining essential continuity in basic religious concepts. His detailed analysis of Mesopotamian creation myths revealed something absolutely fascinating: sophisticated political metaphor hidden beneath apparently simple mythological narrative. These stories about divine conflicts and cosmic organization were actually reflecting contemporary concerns about earthly governance and social order. His work on the Atrahasis epic illuminated the economic and demographic pressures that had shaped Mesopotamian thinking about divine-human relationships, while his analysis of the Enuma Elish revealed the theological innovations that enabled Babylonian scholars to adapt traditional religious concepts for imperial political requirements. The discovery of the library at Sultantepetin, Sutistan, Turkey during excavations conducted by Seton Lloyd and Nuri Gökçe in the 1950s provide scholars with something they'd been desperately seeking: copies of major Mesopotamian literary works that reveal just how extensively traditional religious texts had been preserved and studied in provincial centers throughout the Assyrian Empire. This library's collection of canonical literary works, including multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic and various Anunnaki hymns, demonstrated the systematic efforts Assyrian scholars had made to preserve and standardize Mesopotamian religious literature. But here's what makes this discovery truly extraordinary. The Sultanate tablets included commentaries and scholarly analysis of classical texts that revealed the sophisticated interpretive technique ancient scholars had developed for understanding complex mythological and theological concepts. These ancient commentaries provided modern scholars with explanations of obscure reference and technical terminology that the puzzled researchers for decades, finally enabling accurate translation and interpretation of difficult passage and major literary works. The preservation of both canonical texts and scholarly commentaries demonstrated an intellectual tradition's remarkable continuity that had maintained Mesopotamian religious and literary culture across multiple centuries of political upheaval. French excavation at Marié, conducted by André Parrot, beginning in 1933, uncovered something absolutely staggering: a major administrative center from the early Babylonian period that provided extensive documentation of religious practices and political relationships during a crucial period Mesopotamian history. The palace archives at Mari contained over 25,000 cuneiform tablets documenting diplomatic correspondence, rabbinic diplomatic correspondence, administrative procedures, and religious activities that illuminated how divine kingship and temple administration actually operated during the early second millennium BCE. These Mari letters included detailed accounts of prophetic activities and divine communication that revealed how Mesopotamian rulers maintained relationships with patron deities and sought divine guidance for political and military decisions. These texts provided concrete evidence for the practical operation of theological concepts that scholars had previously known primarily through literary and mythological sources, demonstrating how beliefs about divine authority actually translated into real political and administrative procedures. The recovery of Akkadian literary texts from various sites throughout Mesopotamia enabled scholars to trace Anunnaki mythology's development through different periods and regions, revealing both continuity and innovation in religious thought across more than 2 millennia. The identification of multiple versions of major compositions, including various recensions of the Gilgamesh epic and different traditions regarding creation and flood narrative, demonstrated the dynamic character of Mesopotamian religious literature and the ongoing efforts ancient scholars made to adapt traditional stories to contemporary concerns. Archaeological investigations at Eridu, conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd during the 1940s and 1950s, provided crucial evidence for the earliest development of Mesopotamian religious architecture and confirmed the site's traditional edification as the first city established by the gods. The excavation revealed 17 successive temple levels dating from the Ubaid period through the Neo-Babylonian era documenting continuous religious significance over more than 4 millennia. The earliest temple bluffs showed sophisticated architectural planning that established design principles later adopted throughout Mesopotamia, while votive objects and architectural features demonstrated early development of religious concepts that would later be elaborated in complex theological systems. The continuing discovery and publication of cuneiform text from museum collections and new excavations around those new excavations provide scholars with an ever-expanding corpus of primary source for understanding Anunnaki theology and Mesopotamian religious practice. Major text editions, including the ongoing Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, have made possible increasingly sophisticated analysis of religious terminology and theological concepts. Modern archaeological techniques, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic surface survey, have identified hundreds of previously unknown Mesopotamian sites and provide new opportunities for understanding the geographical distribution and regional variation of Anunnaki worship. These technological advances have enabled archaeologists to investigate previously inaccessible sites while minimizing damage to fragile archaeological remains, ensuring future generations of scholars will have access to well-preserved evidence for understanding ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The integration of archaeological evidence with textual source has created increasingly sophisticated understanding of how Anunnaki theology developed within specific historical and cultural contexts, while comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern religious traditions has illuminated the distinctive characteristics of Mesopotamian religious thought. This multidisciplinary approach has revealed the complexity and sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while demonstrating its fundamental importance for understanding the development of human religious and intellectual culture. This concluding section maintained that captivating flow while wrapping up the incredible story of how ancient Anunnaki tradition survived, transformed, and influenced human civilization for millennia. The rewrite transforms dense academic content into engaging narrative that keeps viewers hooked until the very end. Now here's where our incredible journey through ancient Mesopotamian civilization takes a dramatic turn into the modern world. The systematic recovery of Mesopotamian textual and archaeological evidence throughout the 19th and 20th centuries didn't just uncover ancient artifacts, it established a rock-solid academic foundation for understanding the true historical role of the Anunnaki within ancient Near Eastern civilization. Today's scholarly consensus recognizes these deities as absolutely central figures in the world's earliest urban religious system, representing sophisticated theological concepts that govern the cosmic order, political legitimacy, and social organization throughout 3 entire millennia of Mesopotamian history. Leading Assyriologists, including Jeremy Black, Andrew George, and Mark van de Meerhoop, have demonstrated through painstaking textual analysis and archaeological correlation that the Anunnaki functioned as administrative deities whose authority encompassed both celestial phenomena and terrestrial governance, creating integrated systems of divine kingship that sustained the world's first complex urban societies. Modern academic interpretation emphasizes the Anunnaki's role as patron deities of specific city-state, with individual gods like Enlil at Nippur, Marduk at Babylon, and Inanna at Uruk serving as divine rulers, whose earthly temple functioned as comprehensive administrative centers managing agricultural production, craft specialization, and long-distance trade networks. Archaeological evidence from sites like Jersu, Nippur, and Ur reveals the absolutely massive economic infrastructure required to support these religious institutions. Temple complex employed thousands of workers and controlled vast agricultural estates that generated the surplus wealth necessary for monumental construction projects and elaborate ritual cycles that would make modern corporations look small by comparison. The theological sophistication of Anunnaki worship emerges crystal clear from comparative analysis of creation myths, flood narrative, and divine genealogies preserved in cuneiform literature spanning from early dynastic Sumerian compositions through Neo-Babylonian scholarly commentaries. These texts reveal systematic theological thinking that addressed fundamental questions about cosmic origins, divine authority, human purpose, and moral order through complex mythological narrative, serving both religious and political functions within Mesopotamian society. The Atrahasis epic's account of human creation as divine laborer, the Enuma Elish is justification of Babylonian political supremacy through Marduk's cosmic victory. On various flood narratives, exploration of divine justice demonstrate the intellectual rigor that characterized the mature Mesopotamian religious thought. Academic research has illuminated the historical development of Anunnaki theology through successive periods of political and cultural change, revealing how these religious concepts adapt to serve different social needs while maintaining essential continuity across millennia of historical transformation. The evolution from early Sumerian concepts of divine democracy through later Babylonian emphasis on monarchical divine authority reflects changing political realities, while integration of foreign deities into traditional Anunnaki hierarchies during periods of cultural contact demonstrates the flexibility that enabled these religious traditions to survive conquest and demographic change. But here's where things get absolutely explosive in terms of popular culture impact. The academic understanding of Anunnaki as historical religious phenomena has been completely overshadowed in popular culture by alternative interpretations that treat these deities as extraterrestrial visitors who influenced early human civilization through advanced technology and genetic manipulation. These theories popularized primarily through works of authors like Zecharia Sitchin, Erich von Däniken, and more recently ancient alien television programming, proposed the Sumerian text describing divine activities should be understood as literal accounts of alien intervention rather than mythological narrative expressing religious and political concepts. Sitchin's translation and interpretation of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, beginning with his 1976 publication The 12th Planet, claimed to reveal evidence for an additional planet called Nibiru, whose inhabitants, the Anunnaki, traveled to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for their home planet's atmospheric maintenance. According to Sitchin's interpretation, these extraterrestrial beings genetically modified existing hominid species to create modern humans as a slave labor force, establishing the first human civilizations in Mesopotamia before departing Earth with promises to return during future planetary alignment. Sitchin's theories gained substantial popular following through their presentation in accessible language that promised to reveal hidden truths about human origins, while explaining the rapid development of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. His interpretation of cuneiform texts emphasized passages describing divine beings descending from heaven, teaching humans various technology and possessing powers that seem to exceed normal human capabilities. The author's background in economics and journalism, combined with his claimed expertise in ancient languages, lent apparent credibility to his interpretations among audience lacking specialized knowledge of Mesopotamian studies. This ancient astronaut hypothesis expanded beyond Sitchin-specific interpretation through work of authors like von Däniken, whose chariots of the gods proposed that various ancient monuments and artifacts worldwide provide evidence for extraterrestrial visitation. Von Däniken's approach emphasized visual evidence, including architectural achievements that seem to exceed ancient technological capability, artistic representations that resemble modern aircraft or astronauts, and mythological narratives from multiple cultures describing divine beings with advanced powers and technology. The popularity of these alternative theories reflect broader cultural fascination with extraterrestrial life and dissatisfaction with conventional academic explanations for the rapid development of human civilization during the Neolithic Revolution. The Tiantian astronaut hypothesis offers seemingly simple solutions to complex historical while appealing to contemporary scientific concepts about space travel and genetic engineering that make alien intervention appear plausible within modern technological frameworks. However, professional Assyriologists and archaeologists consistently rejected these alternative interpretations through detailed analysis of linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence that contradict extraterrestrial visitation theories. Michael Heiser's comprehensive critique of Sitchin's translations in the Unseen Realm demonstrated numerous errors in cuneiform reading and interpretation that undermine the foundation for ancient astronaut claims, while Irving Finkel's analysis of Mesopotamian flood narratives in the Ark Before Noah reveals the complex literary and theological development that produced these compositions over centuries of cultural evolution. The archaeological record provides absolutely no evidence for the advanced technologies that would have been necessary for interplanetary travel during ancient periods. While the gradual development of Mesopotamian civilization through successive cultural phases contradicts claims about sudden technological advancement through alien intervention. Excavation at sites like Tel Essowan, Shogamami, and early Uruk reveal the incremental development of agricultural techniques, craft, specialization, and urban organization that produced the complex societies documented in later historical periods. Despite academic rejection, ancient astronaut theories have profoundly influenced popular culture through their incorporation into science fiction literature, television programming, and internet-based alternative history communities. The History Channel's Ancient Alien series, which has produced over 200 episodes since 2009, presents these theories as legitimate scientific hypotheses worthy of serious consideration, featuring interviews with proponents alongside dramatic reenactments and computer-generated imagery that creates compelling visual narratives supporting extraterrestrial interpretations of ancient evidence. This fascinating tension between rigorous academic scholarship and popular alternative interpretation demonstrate how ancient Mesopotamian civilization continues to captivate human imagination. Thousands of years after the fall of Babylon, ensuring that the legacy of the Anunnaki, whether understood as sophisticated religious concepts or mysterious extraterrestrial visitors, remains vibrantly alive in contemporary culture, inspiring both scholarly research and popular fascination that bridges the gap between ancient wisdom and modern wonder. This final section perfectly caps off your incredible journey through Anunnaki history while acknowledging the fascinating modern cultural phenomena surrounding these ancient deities. The rewrite maintains that engaging, retention-optimized flow while respecting both academic scholarship and popular cultural interpretation. The way these shows present their content is absolutely fascinating from a media analysis perspective. The series format typically creates something called false equivalence. They'll present solid archaeological and historical evidence right alongside alternative interpretations that emphasize unexplained aspects of ancient achievements, making both seem equally valid. This presentation strategy is brilliant for appealing to audience skeptical of academic authority while satisfying entertainment preferences for dramatic narratives that promise revolutionary revelations about human history and cosmic significance. But here's where things get really interesting. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary culture goes way beyond ancient astronaut theories. These ancient ideas have exploded into fantasy and science fiction narratives that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian mythology while completely transforming these concepts for modern storytelling purposes. Authors like Neil Gaiman in American Gods and Kim Stanley Robinson in The Years of Rice and Salt have incorporated Mesopotamian deity into complex narrative exploring themes of cultural change, religious evolution, and the human adaptation to technological advancement. These aren't just casual references, these are sophisticated literary works that use ancient concepts to explore deeply modern questions about identity, power, and transformation. The video game industry has particularly embraced the Mesopotamian mythological concepts through games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization that allow players to actually interact with historical civilizations while incorporating fantastical elements derived from ancient religious traditions. These interactive media create immersive experiences that introduce millions of players worldwide to Mesopotamian cultural concepts while transforming them into entertainment content that may bear little resemblance to their original historical contexts. Something absolutely remarkable is happening in contemporary religious circles. Neo-pagan and reconstructionist religious movements have attempted to revive authentic Mesopotamian religious practices through careful study of cuneiform source and archaeological evidence, creating modern religious communities that honor traditional Anunnaki while adapting ancient practices to contemporary social and legal contexts. The Mesopotamian reconstructionist movement, though relatively small, includes practitioners who have actually learned cuneiform script, studied ancient ritual procedures, and created modern adaptations of traditional ceremonies that maintain theological continuity with ancient practices. Imagine people in the 21st century learning to read 4,000-year-old script to practice ancient religion. These contemporary practitioners face enormous challenges in reconstructing authentic ancient religious practices from incomplete textual and archaeological sources, while also adapting traditions developed for ancient urban temple communities to serve the needs of modern individuals and small groups. The absence of continuous traditional transmission requires modern practitioners to rely entirely on scholarly interpretations of ancient sources, creating religious practices that may differ substantially from their ancient predecessors, despite sincere attempts at historical accuracy. The Sumerian Mesopotamian Orthodox Temple movement, established by practitioners seeking authentic reconstructions of ancient religious traditions, has developed ritual practices based on careful study of cuneiform liturgical texts and archaeological evidence for temple procedure. These groups typically emphasize historical accuracy over contemporary spiritual needs, creating religious practices that prioritize authenticity to ancient source, even when this creates practical difficulties for modern practitioners. Other contemporary groups have adopted more flexible approaches that honor Mesopotamian deities while incorporating modern spiritual concepts and practices addressing contemporary religious needs. These syncretic movements may combine Anunnaki worship with elements from other ancient traditions, modern witchcraft practices, or New Age spirituality, creating religious systems that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian source while serving the spiritual needs of modern practitioners. The academic study of these contemporary religious movements has revealed something absolutely absolutely fascinating, a complex relationship between historical scholarship and modern spiritual practice, with reconstructionist groups serving as both consumers and critics of academic research on ancient Mesopotamian religion. These practitioners often possess sophisticated knowledge of cuneiform, source, and archaeological evidence that enables them to engage critically with scholarly interpretations while developing their own understanding of ancient religious concepts and practices. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary culture extends beyond explicit religious or alternative history movements through their incorporation into broader cultural narratives about human origins, technological development, and cosmic significance. The themes of divine creation, technological advancement, and moral judgment that characterize Mesopotamian mythology continue resonating with modern audience through their appearance in science fiction, fantasy literature, and popular philosophy addressing fundamental questions about human nature and destiny. The digital age has created incredible new opportunities for preserving and disseminating knowledge about Anunnaki traditions through online databases, digital archives, and interactive educational resources that make cuneiform texts and archaeological evidence accessible to global audience. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative and the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus provide scholars and interested individuals with access to thousands of primary sources that were previously available only to specialists with access to major research libraries. These digital resources have democratized access to Mesopotamian source material, while also creating new challenges for distinguishing between accurate scholarly information and alternative interpretation that may lack empirical support. The Internet's capacity for rapid information dissemination has enabled both academic research and pseudoscientific theories to reach global audience simultaneously, requiring users to develop critical evaluation skills for assessing the reliability of different sources and interpretations. The contemporary legacy of Anunnaki tradition encompass multiple parallel streams of interpretation and application that serve different cultural functions within modern society. Academic scholarship continue refining understanding of these deity historical roles within ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while alternative theories provide entertainment and speculative frameworks for understanding human origins. Religious reconstructionist movement attempt reviving authentic ancient practices while popular culture adapt Mesopotamian concepts to serve contemporary storytelling and spiritual needs. The enduring appeal of Anunnaki concept across these diverse contemporary applications demonstrates the fundamental importance of the questions that these ancient traditions échangeaient, lesquelles, the Krunwetro, say, that for the divine authority, human purpose, and moral responsibility, whether approached as historical phenomena worthy of scholarly investigation, extraterrestrial visitors offering solutions to cosmic mysteries, or divine beings deserving contemporary worship, the Anunnaki continue providing frameworks for understanding humanity's place within larger cosmic and historical contexts. The scholarly consensus regarding Anunnaki as sophisticated theological concepts developed within the world's earliest urban civilization provides the most reliable foundation for understanding their historical significance and continuing relevance. These deities represented humanity's first systematic attempts to understand cosmic order, political authority, and moral responsibility through complex mythological narratives that integrated religious, political, and practical concerns within comprehensive worldviews that sustained urban civilization for over 3 millennia. The preservation of Anunnaki traditions through cuneiform literature and cryological remains ensures that these ancient concepts will continue influencing human understanding of religious, political, and cultural development regardless of how contemporary interpreters choose to understand their ultimate significance. The careful work of scholars who have recovered, translated, and interpreted this source provides future generations with access to humanity's earliest systematic, theological, and philosophical thinking, demonstrating both the continuity and creativity that have characterized human intellectual development throughout recorded history. The Anunnaki's journey from active deities governing ancient Mesopotamian city-states to subjects of contemporary academic study, popular speculation, and religious revival illustrates the complex processes ancient cultural traditions adapt to serve new social and intellectual needs while maintaining essential continuity with their historical origins. Their continuing presence in modern discourse, whether through scholarly analysis, alternative theory, or contemporary religious practice, testifies to the enduring power of the fundamental questions about human existence, cosmic order, and divine authority that these ancient traditions first systematically addressed over 5,000 years ago. The story of the Anunnaki is ultimately the story of humanity itself, our endless quest to understand our place in the cosmos, our relationship with the divine, and our responsibilities to each other in building civilization that can endure across millennia